The U-2, soaring at an unprecedented 70,000 feet, was believed untouchable in the thin upper atmosphere. Then, disaster struck.
May 1st, 1960, 1:30 p.m. Moscow time, 70,000 feet above Sverdlovsk, Soviet Union. Francis Gary Powers, CIA pilot, call sign Grand Slam, is 4 hours into his mission. He's flying a U-2 spy plane, the most secret aircraft in the American arsenal. His flight path takes him deep into Soviet airspace, photographing military installations the Soviets don't want anyone to see. At 70,000 feet, he's higher than any Soviet fighter can reach, higher than any missile can hit. Or so the CIA believes. The cockpit is cramped, barely larger than a phone booth. Powers wears a full-pressure suit, the same kind astronauts wear. At this altitude, if the cockpit depressurizes, he has seconds before he blacks out. The autopilot is engaged, the camera is running, capturing images of Soviet ICBM sites, bomber bases, radar installations. Everything is going according to plan. Then, at 1:32 p.m., Powers sees a flash of orange light behind the aircraft. A Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile has detonated. The shock wave hits the U-2. The aircraft shudders violently. The right wing tears off. The nose pitches down. Powers is thrown forward against his harness. The U-2, the untouchable spy plane that was supposed to be invulnerable, is breaking apart at 70,000 feet. Powers has seconds to make a decision. The CIA gave him a silver dollar. Inside it, hidden, is a poison needle tipped with saxitoxin. One scratch, and he'll be dead in seconds. The CIA's orders are clear. If you're going down over the Soviet Union, use the needle. Do not allow yourself to be captured. Powers reaches for the ejection handle instead. This is the story of how one pilot survived the impossible and how his shootdown changed the Cold War forever.
Ensure the intake manifold is perfectly aligned before the next phase of testing.
To understand how Powers ended up at 70,000 feet over the Soviet Union, you have to go back to 1954 and understand why the U-2 existed in the first place. The Cold War was at its height. The Soviet Union had detonated its first hydrogen bomb. The United States needed to know what the Soviets were building, where their military bases were, how many bombers and missiles they had. But how do you gather intelligence on a closed society that doesn't allow foreigners to travel freely? How do you photograph military installations 1,000 miles inside Soviet territory? The answer: fly over them. In 1954, the CIA approached Lockheed's Skunk Works, the secretive division that had built the P-80 jet fighter and other advanced aircraft. The CIA wanted something that didn't exist, an aircraft that could fly higher than 70,000 feet, beyond the reach of Soviet fighters and missiles. An aircraft that could carry cameras capable of photographing objects from 13 miles up. An aircraft that could fly deep into Soviet airspace and return. Kelly Johnson, the legendary designer who ran Skunk Works, said he could do it in 8 months. He did it in 8 months. The U-2, designated for utility, though that was a cover name, was unlike any aircraft ever built. It had wings like a glider, 103 feet from tip to tip, longer than the fuselage. The wings were so long and flexible they would bend and flex in flight. The fuselage was narrow, just wide enough for a single pilot and the cameras. No weapons, no defensive systems. The only defense was altitude. The engine was a Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet modified to operate in the thin air at 70,000 feet. At that altitude, the air pressure is so low that a normal engine would flame out. The J57 was specially tuned to burn fuel efficiently in an environment where there's barely any oxygen. The landing gear was unusual: 2 main wheels in the center of the fuselage and 2 detachable pogo wheels under the wings for takeoff. On landing, the wings would drag on the ground. Ground crews would run out and attach the pogo wheels so the aircraft could taxi. It was fragile, difficult to fly, and uncomfortable. Pilots called it the Dragon Lady. But it could do something no other aircraft could do. It could fly at 70,000 feet for over 9 hours, covering thousands of miles. The first operational U-2 flight over the Soviet Union took place on July 4, 1956. Pilot Hervey Stockman flew from West Germany over Moscow, Leningrad, and the Baltic states, then landed in Norway. The mission lasted over 8 hours. The cameras brought back thousands of images of Soviet military installations. The Soviets knew he was there. Their radars tracked him. But they couldn't touch him. Their MiG-19 fighters could barely reach 55,000 feet. Their SA-1 surface-to-air missiles couldn't reach 70,000 feet. They protested diplomatically, but there was nothing they could do. Over the next 4 years, the CIA flew dozens of U-2 missions over the Soviet Union. They photographed bomber bases, missile sites, submarine pens, nuclear facilities. The intelligence was invaluable. It confirmed that the bomber gap and missile gap that American politicians feared didn't exist. The Soviets had fewer bombers and missiles than the U.S. had thought, but the Soviets were working on a solution. The SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile was designed specifically to reach high-altitude aircraft. It had a range of 30 miles and could reach altitudes of 80,000 feet. By 1960, the Soviets had deployed hundreds of SA-2 batteries across the Soviet Union. The CIA knew about the SA-2. They knew it was a threat. But they believed, based on tests and analysis, that the U-2 was still safe. The SA-2 would have to score a direct hit, or a very close proximity hit, to bring down a U-2. The odds, they calculated, were low. They were wrong. On May 1, 1960, Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in a U-2 designated Article 360. His mission, codenamed Grand Slam, was one of the most ambitious ever attempted. He would fly north across Afghanistan into Soviet airspace over the Aral Sea, then northeast over Soviet ICBM sites near Tyuratam and Chelyabinsk, then over Sverdlovsk, a major industrial city in the Urals, and finally northwest to land in Bodø, Norway. Total distance, over 3,800 miles. Total flight time, over 9 hours. The deepest penetration of Soviet airspace ever attempted. Powers was 30 years old, a former Air Force pilot who had been recruited by the CIA in 1956. He had flown over 25 U-2 missions, including several over the Soviet Union. He was experienced, calm, and professional. The flight plan called for him to reach 70,000 feet and maintain that altitude for most of the mission. At that height, he would be above the weather, above commercial air traffic, and theoretically above Soviet defenses. The first 4 hours of the flight were uneventful. Powers crossed into Soviet airspace. The autopilot was engaged. The cameras were running. Everything was working perfectly. Soviet radar tracked him from the moment he crossed the border. Air defense commanders scrambled fighters, but the MiGs couldn't reach him. They tried to intercept, but by the time they climbed to 55,000 feet, Powers was long gone. Then the SA-2 batteries were alerted. Near Sverdlovsk, a battery commander named Mikhail Voronov received orders to engage the intruder. Voronov had been tracking Powers on radar for 20 minutes. He had a firing solution. At 1:32 p.m., Voronov gave the order. 3 SA-2 missiles launched. The missiles climbed at over 2,000 mph. Powers, at 70,000 feet, didn't see them coming. There was no warning. No radar warning receiver, no defensive systems. The first missile missed. The second missile detonated 200 feet behind the U-2. The shockwave was enough. The U-2's tail section was torn off. The right wing separated. The aircraft went into an uncontrollable spin. Francis Gary Powers, at 70,000 feet, was about to find out if he could survive the impossible. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. If you or a family member worked on the U-2 program or in Cold War intelligence, we'd love to hear your story.
Mayday! 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 I'm losing control! The windscreen is failing.
The moment the SA-2 detonated, Powers knew he was in trouble. The U-2 didn't explode, the missile didn't score a direct hit, but the shockwave was enough. At 70,000 feet, the air is so thin that even a small amount of structural damage is catastrophic. The tail section, which housed the aircraft's stability and control systems, was torn away. Without the tail, the U-2 was uncontrollable. The nose pitched down violently. The aircraft entered a flat spin, tumbling through the sky. Powers was thrown forward against his harness. The G-forces were immense. He couldn't reach the controls. He couldn't reach the ejection handle. He couldn't do anything except hold on. The U-2 was designed to be light. Every pound mattered at 70,000 feet. But that lightness made it fragile. The wings, which were designed to flex and bend, began to tear under the stress of the spin. The right wing separated completely. The aircraft, now missing its tail and one wing, tumbled even more violently. Powers' training kicked in. He needed to eject. But there was a problem. The U-2's ejection seat was designed to work at high altitude, but only if the aircraft was relatively stable. In a violent spin, ejecting could be fatal. The seat might not clear the aircraft. Or worse, the pilot might be thrown into the remaining wing or fuselage. Powers tried to reach the ejection handle. The G-forces made it nearly impossible. His arm felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He couldn't reach it. The aircraft continued to tumble. 70,000 feet, 65,000 feet, 60,000 feet, falling at over 10,000 feet per minute. Powers made a decision. If he couldn't eject, he would try to manually bail out. He would open the canopy, release his harness, and try to climb out of the cockpit. It was insane. At 60,000 feet, the air pressure was so low that his pressure suit was the only thing keeping him alive. If the suit failed, he would lose consciousness in seconds. And climbing out of a spinning aircraft at 60,000 feet? No one had ever done that, but he had no choice. Powers reached for the canopy release. The canopy, held in place by explosive bolts, was designed to jettison in an emergency. He pulled the handle. The canopy blew off. Instantly, the wind tore at him. The noise was deafening. The cold was unbearable. At 60,000 feet, the temperature is 60 degrees below zero. Powers released his harness. He tried to stand up in the cockpit. The G-forces and the wind made it nearly impossible. He was being pressed back into the seat by the centrifugal force of the spin. Then, suddenly, the aircraft broke apart. The fuselage, weakened by the loss of the tail and wing, couldn't withstand the stress. It fractured. Powers was thrown clear, still strapped to his seat by the oxygen hose and one leg strap he hadn't fully released. He tumbled through the sky, attached to the wreckage by a thin oxygen hose and a strap. He was falling at over 200 mph. If he didn't get free, he would hit the ground still attached to the wreckage. Powers pulled out his survival knife. He cut the oxygen hose. He cut the leg strap. He was free, but he was still falling. 50,000 feet, 45,000 feet, 40,000 feet. His parachute had an automatic opener set to deploy at 15,000 feet. That was standard for high-altitude bailouts. If you opened the parachute too high, you would spend too long in the thin, freezing air. You could freeze to death or suffocate before reaching the ground. So Powers fell. For over 3 minutes he fell through the sky, tumbling, unable to control his descent. At 15,000 feet, the automatic opener triggered. The parachute deployed. The sudden deceleration was violent, but the parachute held. Powers was alive. He looked around. Below him, the Soviet countryside. Fields, forests, a small town. He could see people looking up, pointing at him. He thought about the silver dollar in his pocket, the poison needle, the CIA's orders. He decided not to use it. Powers landed in a field near the town of Sverdlovsk. Soviet soldiers and civilians were already running toward him. He tried to destroy the destruct switches on his survival radio, but he didn't have time. The soldiers reached him before he could finish. They surrounded him, rifles pointed. One soldier shouted in Russian. Powers didn't speak Russian, but the meaning was clear. "Hands up! Don't move!" Francis Gary Powers, CIA pilot, was now a prisoner of the Soviet Union. The Soviets had shot down the untouchable spy plane, and they had captured the pilot alive. Powers was taken to KGB headquarters in Moscow. He was placed in Lubyanka prison, the infamous facility where political prisoners and spies were held. The interrogation began immediately. The KGB wanted to know everything. Who sent him? What was his mission? What did he photograph? What other flights had been conducted? Who else was involved? Powers had been trained for this. The CIA had given him a cover story. If captured, he was to say he was a weather research pilot who had strayed off course. He was not to reveal anything about the U-2 program, the CIA, or the missions. But the KGB already knew most of it. The wreckage of the U-2 had been recovered. The cameras were intact. The film was intact. The Soviets had thousands of images of their own military installations, photographed from 70,000 feet. They knew exactly what Powers had been doing. And they had Powers' survival pack. Inside it, they found maps marked with Soviet military sites. They found gold coins and rubles, currency for escape and evasion. They found the silver dollar with the poison needle. The KGB interrogators showed Powers the evidence. They told him they knew he was a spy. They knew he worked for the CIA. There was no point in lying. Powers made a decision. He would cooperate, to a point. He would confirm what the Soviets already knew from the wreckage and the survival pack, but he would not reveal anything about other pilots, other missions, or CIA operations. It was a delicate balance. Cooperate enough to avoid torture or execution, but don't betray your country or your fellow pilots. The interrogation lasted for weeks. The KGB was professional, methodical. They didn't torture Powers physically, but the psychological pressure was immense. Long interrogation sessions, sleep deprivation, isolation, threats of execution. Powers stuck to his strategy. He confirmed the basic facts. Yes, he was a CIA pilot. Yes, he was on a reconnaissance mission. Yes, he was photographing Soviet military sites. But he refused to provide details about other missions or other pilots. The Soviets, meanwhile, were preparing a propaganda victory. On May 5, 1960, 4 days after the shootdown, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced to the world that the Soviet Union had shot down an American spy plane. He didn't mention that the pilot had survived. He wanted to see how the United States would respond. President Dwight Eisenhower, not knowing Powers was alive, authorized a cover story. The U.S. government announced that a NASA weather research aircraft had gone missing over Turkey. The pilot may have strayed off course due to oxygen system failure. It was a plausible story, and it might have worked, except for one thing. On May 7th, Khrushchev announced that the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was alive and in Soviet custody. He had confessed to being a CIA spy. The wreckage and cameras had been recovered. The film had been developed. The United States had been caught in a lie. Eisenhower was furious, not at Powers, but at the situation. The U-2 program, which had been one of the most successful intelligence operations of the Cold War, was now exposed. The Soviets had proof that the United States had been violating Soviet airspace for years. A summit meeting between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, scheduled for later that month in Paris, collapsed. Khrushchev demanded an apology. Eisenhower refused. The Cold War, which had shown signs of thawing, froze again, and Powers, in his cell in Lubyanka, waited to learn his fate. On August 19, 1960, Powers was put on trial in Moscow. The trial was public, broadcast on Soviet television and radio. It was a show trial designed to embarrass the United States and demonstrate Soviet strength. Powers was charged with espionage. The evidence was overwhelming. The wreckage, the cameras, the film, his own confession. The verdict was never in doubt. Powers testified for 3 days. He answered questions from the prosecutor, from his own defense attorney, appointed by the Soviet state, and from the judges. He was calm, factual, and careful. He admitted to espionage, but he didn't provide any information that wasn't already known. The Soviet prosecutor asked why Powers hadn't used the poison needle. Powers replied that he had been trained to use it only if torture was imminent. Since the Soviets had treated him correctly under international law, he saw no reason to kill himself. It was a clever answer. It implied that the Soviets were civilized, which pleased the judges, and it avoided the question of whether Powers had been ordered to commit suicide, which would have been embarrassing for the CIA. On August 19th, the court delivered its verdict. Guilty. The sentence, 10 years, 3 years in prison, 7 years in a labor camp. Powers was sent to Vladimir Central Prison, about 150 miles east of Moscow. It was a grim facility built in the 18th century, with thick stone walls and tiny cells. Powers settled into a routine. He was kept in solitary confinement, isolated from other prisoners. He was allowed to write letters to his wife, Barbara, though the letters were censored. He read books from the prison library. He exercised in his cell. He waited. Back in the United States, the CIA and the State Department were working on a plan to bring him home. The plan involved a trade. The Soviets held Powers. The United States held Rudolf Abel, a Soviet KGB officer who had been arrested in New York in 1957 and convicted of espionage. Abel was serving a 30-year sentence in a federal prison in Atlanta. Negotiations took over a year. The Soviets wanted Abel back. The United States wanted Powers back. But both sides had to be careful. Neither wanted to appear weak. Finally, in February 1962, an agreement was reached. Powers and Abel would be exchanged on the Glienicke Bridge, a bridge connecting West Berlin and Potsdam in East Germany. The bridge had been used for prisoner exchanges before. It was known as the Bridge of Spies. On February 10, 1962, at 8:20 a.m., Francis Gary Powers walked across the Glienicke Bridge. From the other side, Rudolf Abel walked toward him. They passed each other in the middle of the bridge. Neither spoke. Powers reached the American side. He was free. He had survived the shootdown. He had survived the interrogation. He had survived 2 years in Soviet prison. And now he was going home. Powers returned to the United States on February 10, 1962. He expected a hero's welcome. He got something very different. The CIA debriefed him extensively. They wanted to know everything about his interrogation, what he had told the Soviets, how he had been treated. Powers told them everything. He had cooperated with the Soviets to a limited extent, confirming what they already knew, but he had not betrayed any classified information that wasn't already compromised by the wreckage. The CIA concluded that Powers had acted appropriately. He had survived an impossible situation. He had protected sensitive information. He had endured 2 years of imprisonment. He deserved recognition. But the public didn't see it that way. Some politicians and media commentators criticized Powers for not using the poison needle. They said he should have killed himself rather than allow himself to be captured. They said he had embarrassed the United States by confessing to espionage. Some questioned why he hadn't destroyed the aircraft. The U-2 had a destruct system, explosive charges designed to destroy the cameras and sensitive equipment if the aircraft was going down. Powers was supposed to activate the destruct system before ejecting, but Powers had been in a spinning, disintegrating aircraft at 70,000 feet. He had been fighting to survive. Activating the destruct system, which required flipping switches and waiting 70 seconds for the charges to detonate, wasn't possible. The criticism stung. Powers had survived an ordeal that would have killed most men. He had endured interrogation and imprisonment, and now, instead of being celebrated, he was being questioned. The Senate Armed Services Committee held hearings. Powers testified. He explained his actions. He answered every question. The committee concluded that Powers had acted in accordance with his training and instructions and had conducted himself in an exemplary manner. But the damage was done. Powers' reputation was tarnished. He was seen by some as a man who had failed, who had been captured, who had confessed. It was unfair, but it was the reality. Powers tried to move on. He wrote a memoir, Operation Overflight, published in 1970. The book told his side of the story, detailing the U-2 program, the shootdown, the interrogation, and the aftermath. The book was well received by those who read it, but it didn't change public perception. Powers remained a controversial figure. He worked for Lockheed for a few years, test-flying aircraft. Then he became a helicopter pilot for a Los Angeles television station, KNBC, flying traffic and news helicopters. It was a quiet life, far from the high-altitude espionage missions of his youth. But Powers seemed content. He had survived. He had come home. He had a family. On August 1st, 1977, Powers was flying a helicopter for KNBC, covering a brush fire in the Santa Barbara area. The helicopter ran out of fuel and crashed. Powers and his cameraman, George Spears, were killed. Powers was 47 years old. The crash was ruled an accident. Investigators concluded that Powers had misjudged his fuel reserves. It was a tragic end for a man who had survived so much. But Powers' story didn't end there. In the years after his death, declassified documents and interviews with former CIA officials revealed the full extent of the U-2 program and Powers' role in it. The documents confirmed that Powers had acted appropriately during the shootdown and interrogation. He had protected sensitive information. He had endured imprisonment with dignity. In 2000, on the 40th anniversary of the shootdown, the CIA awarded Powers the Director's Medal for extreme fidelity and extraordinary courage in the line of duty. It was the CIA's highest honor. Powers' family accepted the medal on his behalf. His son, Francis Gary Powers, Jr., said, "My father was a patriot who served his country with honor. It took 40 years. But his reputation has finally been restored." In 2012, Powers was posthumously awarded the Silver Star, the U.S. military's third highest decoration for valor. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious service from May 1960 to February 1962, while held as a prisoner of war in the Soviet Union." Today, you can see the wreckage of Powers' U-2 at the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. The Soviets put it on display as a trophy, proof of their ability to shoot down American spy planes. You can also see a U-2 at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. It's displayed in the Cold War Gallery, a reminder of the secret war fought in the skies above the Iron Curtain. And at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., there's an exhibit dedicated to Francis Gary Powers. It includes his pressure suit, his survival pack, and the silver dollar with the poison needle he never used. Powers's story is a reminder that the Cold War wasn't just about missiles and bombs. It was about intelligence, about knowing what the other side was doing. And it was about the men and women who risked their lives to gather that intelligence. Powers flew into Soviet airspace knowing he might not come back. He survived the impossible, and he paid a price for it. But in the end, history has been kind to him. He's remembered not as a man who failed, but as a man who served his country in one of the most dangerous jobs of the Cold War. If you or a family member worked on the U-2 program or served in Cold War intelligence, please share your story in the comments. These stories are part of history, and they deserve to be told. The shootdown of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 changed the way America conducted espionage. After May 1, 1960, the CIA stopped flying U-2 missions over the Soviet Union. The risk was too great. The Soviets had proven they could shoot down the U-2, and they had proven they could capture the pilot alive. But the need for intelligence didn't go away. If anything, it became more urgent. The Soviets were building more missiles, more bombers, more nuclear weapons. The United States needed to know what they were doing. The solution was satellites. The CIA and the Air Force had been developing reconnaissance satellites since the mid-1950s, but the technology wasn't mature. The early satellites, code-named Corona, had limited capabilities. The cameras weren't as good as the U-2's cameras. The satellites couldn't be maneuvered easily. And recovering the film required the satellite to eject a capsule that would re-enter the atmosphere and be caught in mid-air by a specially equipped aircraft. But after the Powers shoot-down, satellite reconnaissance became a priority. Funding increased. Technology improved. By the mid-1960s, satellites had largely replaced the U-2 for reconnaissance over the Soviet Union. The U-2 didn't disappear, though. It continued to fly missions over other countries, places where the risk of being shot down was lower. U-2s flew over Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, providing the photographs that proved the Soviets were installing nuclear missiles there. U-2s flew over Vietnam, providing intelligence on North Vietnamese troop movements and supply lines. U-2s flew over the Middle East, over Africa, over Asia, and they still fly today. The U-2, now designated the U-2S, is still in service with the U.S. Air Force. It's been upgraded with modern avionics, better cameras, and improved engines, but the basic design, the long wings, the high-altitude capability remains the same. U-2s fly reconnaissance missions over conflict zones, providing real-time intelligence to commanders on the ground. They monitor nuclear facilities in North Korea and Iran. They track terrorist movements in the Middle East and Africa. The U-2 is one of the oldest aircraft still in active military service. It first flew in 1955. That's 70 years ago. And it's still flying. Why? Because it's still effective. Satellites are excellent for broad area surveillance, but they follow predictable orbits. You can't quickly reposition a satellite to look at a specific target. The U-2, on the other hand, can be sent to a specific location on short notice. It can loiter over a target for hours. It can provide real-time intelligence. The Air Force has tried to replace the U-2 several times. The SR-71 Blackbird was supposed to replace it, but the SR-71 was too expensive to operate and was retired in 1998. The Global Hawk drone was supposed to replace it, but the Global Hawk can't fly as high or carry as many sensors. The U-2 remains. The pilots who fly the U-2 today are part of a unique community. There are only about 80 U-2 pilots in the world, all of them in the U.S. Air Force. They fly missions that are still classified. They wear pressure suits, just like Powers did. They fly at 70,000 feet, just like Powers did. And they know the story of Francis Gary Powers. It's part of their training. They learn about the shootdown, the interrogation, the imprisonment. They learn about the risks of the mission. One current U-2 pilot, interviewed for a documentary, said, "Every time I fly, I think about Gary Powers. He was doing the same mission I'm doing, in a much more dangerous environment. He survived the impossible. That's inspiring." Powers' story has been told in books, documentaries, and films. The 2015 film Bridge of Spies, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Tom Hanks, tells the story of Powers' capture and the negotiations to bring him home. The film was critically acclaimed and introduced Powers' story to a new generation. Powers' son, Francis Gary Powers, Jr., has dedicated his life to preserving his father's legacy. He founded the Cold War Museum in Virginia, which includes exhibits on the U-2 program, the shootdown, and the prisoner exchange. He gives lectures and interviews telling his father's story. "My father was a hero," Powers Jr. says. "He served his country in one of the most dangerous jobs imaginable. He survived an ordeal that would have broken most men. And he did it with dignity and honor." That's the story I want people to know. The U-2 program and Powers' shootdown also had a broader impact on the Cold War. It demonstrated that neither side could keep secrets forever. The Soviets knew the U.S. was flying spy planes over their territory. The U.S. knew the Soviets were trying to shoot them down. Both sides knew that the other side knew. This mutual awareness, paradoxically, may have helped prevent World War III. Both sides knew what the other side had. There were no surprises, no sudden attacks. The intelligence gathered by the U-2 and later by satellites helped both sides understand each other's capabilities and intentions. It was a strange kind of peace, built on espionage and surveillance. But it was peace. Francis Gary Powers flew into Soviet airspace on May 1, 1960, to gather intelligence that would help prevent war. He was shot down, he was captured, he was imprisoned, but he survived. And the intelligence he and other U-2 pilots gathered helped keep the Cold War cold. That's his legacy. Not the shootdown, not the interrogation, not the controversy. His legacy is that he served his country in a job that required extraordinary courage, and he did it well. The U-2 still flies, the mission continues, and Francis Gary Powers is remembered as one of the men who made it possible. Thank you for watching. For more Cold War espionage and technology stories, check out the other videos on your screen.